Hi everyone.
Hi everyone.
So, Anima versus Shadow, or indeed Animus versus Shadow.
Yes, yes.
Oh dear, that can lead to a lot of trouble, can't it?
Indeed.
But which one is which? In any individual case, if you're a follower of Jungian psychology and you experience some kind of behavior from somebody, how do you determine whether it's their shadow or their anima or animus, or indeed your own? And what does it really mean in terms of projecting either or both of those onto somebody else? These are questions that aren't really very clearly answered in classic Jung, and for the most part, the mainstream Jungians haven't done very much to help people in an everyday sense with this at all. So we're going to have a go at this and keep it as simple and direct as we can. And Pauline smiling, yes, how difficult is that going to be? Yes, well, it will be, won't it? Of course, but never you mind, we'll try. So how about if we start with this then? If somebody projects their shadow in a classical Jungian sense, then it's understood that the contents of the shadow are within the person who does the projecting. So in other words, people project their so-called inferiorities onto the object of the other. But when they withdraw the shadow, then they're supposed to understand that it's really them or part of them.
Yes, indeed. And right on time, we're having a dimming of the light again.
Yeah. Well, I'm always doing that.
It keeps happening to us, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Usually when I'm speaking, for some strange reason, things go dark.
Because you mentioned the shadows.
Oh yeah, well, how about letting in some light? Oh.
Well, yes, it'd be good to do that.
Yeah.
Even if it's only metaphorical light rather than real light. Yeah, I mean, on a serious note, Steve, though, this is the stuff of relationships, isn't it?
It is.
And particularly intimate relationships, because obviously in those relationships, you usually spend a lot of your time and a lot of your energy trying to get on with whoever that person is.
Yeah.
If people are a little bit more remote to you, a bit more distant, it's easier to modulate your own responses and reactions to somebody that you don't see very often, say, as opposed to somebody who you live with intimately day in, day out.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And yeah, they're the things I think that need to be understood and resolved if that relationship is to remain agreeable, and if it's to have longevity to it, then we do have to get to grips with these things. And we need to see too how outside of our own context we might be being manipulated by influences that we have maybe less control over, but nonetheless seep into our lives and influence the way that we respond to ourselves and to the people that we're in close relationship to.
Interesting. So would you include theoretical approaches to understanding human nature as these extrinsic influences, such as when we start to use Jungian concepts like the shadow, anima and animus, then they can influence us as well? I mean, typology certainly does. That's one of the worst traps that there is, which we could maybe discuss later in this video. But specifically about the shadow and the anima or animus, then we tend to, if we're not talking to a Jungian, not use those terms at all. And we talk about what we call the relating function, because that's what we do with it, we relate. The minute that we fall into that orthodox line of saying you must deal with the shadow first before you deal with the animus or the anima, then there are problems, because people start to go into themselves in such a way that they stop relating. It's almost a schizoid kind of self-absorbed, to look at your dark side, as if you have literally a neurotic split that is so deep it runs down to the core of your being.
Yeah, and clearly that's not helpful.
No.
And I think, as you've often said, Steve, relating is there from the start. Isn't it? From the moment that we're born. In order to survive, we have to engage with our mother, our caregiver, in order to relate and to ensure our survival. So relating's there right at the start. And that's certainly what we see. We see it in our own lives, we see it in the lives of the people that we work with, that where the relating is good, the shadow is not a problem, it's not an issue.
That's a really good point. So I'll let in some light, excuse me. Just a little, not too much. We've always said, based on, and it's now 42 years of frontline clinical experience with thousands of people, that if you deal with relating and you get that right, then those things normally ascribed to the Jungian concept of the shadow just aren't a problem in everyday adaptation at all. In fact, you have to look for the shadow to actually find it if your relating is really good. And in that sense, then the shadow performs a normal compensatory function, which you would expect in a homeostatic or self-regulating system. If, however, somebody is deeply, deeply neurotic and split right down the middle, then you see the thing that the Jungians go on about as if it were normal, and it isn't normal in that way at all. So disturbances to relating, they are the thing which then constellate that which is called the shadow by the Jungians. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no. Yes, obviously, I agree with that, Steve. And it begs the question, what is good relating?
Oh, yes, it does, doesn't it? Yes, yeah. Yes. Well, I would apply the principle I do to most things, which is homeostasis. And any system which is going to persist in time and be healthy will have to self-regulate. And if you think of the old saying from Aesop, live and let live, that's a kind of a really high register of homeostasis. If we could all live and let live, then everything would pretty much even out and we could all get along well. But if we don't live and let live, then homeostasis at whatever register of relationship is broken down, whether that's cultural, between people, ourselves, to ourselves on the inside. So following what is natural and relating in a natural way is the most important thing, I would say.
So you're likely to see less of live and let live, where if we go back to Jung's concepts of the anima and the animus, where that's projected, you're less likely to see that kind of tolerance of others.
Really good point, because, and think about it this way, I think that will be useful. When we say to someone, you are projecting your shadow, or you find that you're doing it yourself, then it's implicit that what is projected is actually yours. But the thing about the anima or the animus is that, and this is really misleading, unfortunately, with respect to the way that Jungians as a whole approach this. If a man projects his anima, it is held to be the case that it's an inner woman inside the psyche of a man, which is then projected onto an outer object. But when you think about it, the same dynamics are involved as in shadow projection. This is something that all belongs to the individual, and that much Jungians, Orthodox Jungians, would agree with. But the thing is that what is projected in the form of the anima has almost zero to do with the reality of women in general or any woman in particular. The anima is part of a man's psyche. You do not understand women through your anima, guys. You would understand women by understanding the animus, because the animus is feminine psychology. The anima is masculine psychology. And it doesn't always turn up in the form of a woman either through projection. And even Jung himself was very clear about that and how he stated it, because it can move into the kind of representation of a religion, of a philosophy, of a relatedness to the natural landscape, to creativity in all of its forms. A part of it is concerned with relating to women, and fundamentally that is biological. But what is projected is the attachments, which is based in the genome and in the field representation that we all carry as men to anticipate relating to women. It's the anticipation which is projected, and that provides the vehicle and the impetus for libido and for instinct to attach to women, usually, but not always, as I say. So to reduce the anima to being a representative of the feminine and to say it's the feminine side of a man is not true. Frankly, it is not true. The anima is masculine psychology. The animus is feminine psychology.
Yes, for sure. And some of what you've just said would be absolutely true for women as well, Stephen. To be honest with you, this is really why we favour the idea of a relating function sometimes as opposed to the anima or the animus, because the idea of relating is a much broader concept than just the kind of relationships that we tend to think about that take place between men and women. So, for example, women are attracted to ideas, and causes and intellectual pursuit just as much as men are, really, and sometimes so much so that when they do project onto men, and if it is a man who has a great intellectual capacity, for example, it's that which is attractive, even more than the man who has the intellect. And sometimes some women will want to separate men from their intellect and dispose of the man, as if to take the intellect, you know, by itself. So that's what I mean when I say about the, you know, the animus, when it's projected, will relate to ideas every bit as much as it will relate to individual men. And it's something that's really very important, I think, for men to get a grip of, because that's where women can be vulnerable and where they can be manipulated, particularly by the culture. For example, something like feminism as an ideology or as a movement is a gift to the negative animus, because what it does is it keeps women dissatisfied, it keeps them disgruntled, it keeps them in a divided state. And then what tends to happen then is that the negative side, the shadow side of the animus, gets projected onto men in the form of misandry. That's what we see. The men are responsible for all women's ills and ailings, and it's so much more comfortable to just blame them than to accept that that originates in themselves. And that's the cause of so much suffering, not only for women, but for men, and then obviously for relationships as well.
Oh, that's very interesting. Number of things there. So really then, women need to stop blaming men for the state of their own animus, i.e. their own psyche. And men need to stop blaming women for the state of their so-called anima, because that's part of the masculine psyche. So apart from owning your own shadow, which is a common theme for Jungians, really we should own our own anima and animus, our own relating, and understand what our actual psychology is, rather than seeing it in the other. And the reason obviously to see it in the other is that this brings about relating. So if a man projects his anima onto a woman, then he is inclined towards relating towards her. So it serves all sorts of goals. I thought it was really interesting what you're saying about some women wanting to take a man's intellect and then discarding the man. Lads, if you're listening, think about that. This is another kind of succubus.
Oh, yes.
It's another way that you can have your soul taken from you, you know, in that mythological sort of way that Jungians are so fond of speaking. But this does happen. It happens all the time, and very often it doesn't really matter what the man looks like. And Jung himself said that. It says that just because he says it, this is more or less paraphrasing Jung, it doesn't matter what he looks like, because he has said it. And because he said it, it's all true. And then the woman internalizes that. But there's an element there where she's taking something from the man, but only because there's something in her that wants to do that, because it's already latent within her, and she's not accepted that within herself or integrated it within herself. But it doesn't belong in the man. It's actually latent in the woman.
I have to pause. I'm sorry, I got a tickle.
That's all right. Don't you worry. We'll carry on while Pauline has a tickle. Yeah. So what we have there is, I think, a pretty good example of how the succubus can work in a different kind of way.
I mean, you could argue from that perspective that it would probably be better if a woman did project onto a cause like feminism than onto an individual man. And then just attempt to drain him of his lifeblood, his libido, his intellect. I mean, it's a safer vehicle for it, really, than in the context of a relationship where it's that driven, where it's that focused. It would be better, I think, utilized in that way.
Yeah, it would. So again, guys, if you want to understand women, you need to understand the animus. Do not look in at your so-called anima, because all you will see in there is that which is likely to be projected onto women, but other things too, of course. And it's the same with the animus. So what about the idea of the anima versus the shadow then? Well, firstly, that's to do with what are we actually seeing when we interact with other people. And there's an inkling within ourselves, some kind of warning that there's a kind of a projection going on. is it our shadow or is this our anima or animus? Well, here, this is where the Jungians get confused amongst themselves again, because depending on what part of Jung's original writings you source or reference, and then who you listen to within the Jungian orthodoxy, the shadow can be the vast majority of a man's psyche because it represents the unconscious as a whole. But so does the anima, apparently. The anima is the unconscious. It's the persona of the unconscious for Jungians, and it's also sometimes the whole of it. And it's a soul image, which, if the anima were feminine, would mean that a man's psyche were at least 99% feminine. Therefore, a man is really a woman rather than being a man. And whereas that might be very woke these days, it doesn't really configure itself accurately in the cultural conditions under which those ideas were formed. That is to say, the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the life of Carl Jung. So they're a bit confused about their own terms. And some of that comes about really historically because of the way that Jung's own life unfolded. And he tended to create something as it occurred to him, create as a concept. So that's why the persona is the first thing that you get in Jungian psychology, that when his own persona was threatened by his own behavior, then he came up with the idea of the persona not being the real person and so forth. Then he had a look at the shadow, which was to some extent the opposite of the persona. And then when he got into working on himself on the inside with the help of a lot of different women other than his wife, then the anima became suddenly important for him as well. And he reified the process in the way that we're familiar with today. But if we take away the concept of it being an inner woman and simply saying this was all about relating, all of it, then things start to clarify out and we can make observations of real people in the real world and how their life unfolds. So I would say that if we're going to use these terms with real people rather than people who've been exposed to rather strange ideas from the past, then we have to be very careful about what we think we're looking at.
Well, we do, and I think as you were hinting at, Steve, if you then add something like typology into that mix, and you follow the Jungian line that a man's anima will be oppositely configured to his ego, then if we were to take you as an example, then the vast majority of your unconscious mind would be an ESFJ. So you would be a very extroverted sort of feeling kind of, well, could it still, is it still accurate to say that you would be functioning as a man at that point? It's hard to know, isn't it? Because the actual logic of it runs out very quickly. And it's clearly nonsense.
It runs out in Jung's book, Psychological Types, because these functions are functions of consciousness. Now, those functions may be undifferentiated, in other words, unassociated to consciousness, and so are therefore unconscious, but they are not the unconscious. You cannot type the unconscious because the unconscious is not the ego. And all of those functions are a suite of options, basically, that can be developed and deployed for the ego, for ordinary everyday consciousness. So any of these elaborations you get on Myers-Briggs or even Jung's original model, which talk about all sorts of little people running around inside the so-called unconscious, and they're reified into demons and tricksters and whatever else it might be, that's all utter nonsense in terms of Jung's original model. So those cognitive functions, as they get called these days, are cognitive functions of consciousness. The unconscious does not have a type because the unconscious is not your conscious mind. It is conscious, but it's differently conscious. And that's another topic that we can come to.
It's an important point to make, Steve, in the context of relationships, because we see so often that people use typology as a stick to beat the other person with, and people they draw lines, they become entrenched. It's the same way that people get entrenched with things like horoscopes, and they think somehow it sums them up sufficiently that it's worth defending. And you do have to be so careful about it, because like I say, if you try and tack that on to some of the other Jungian ideas, it doesn't work. It's nonsense. It doesn't. That dog don't hunt, as you often say. So we have to be very, very careful about how we use it, and use it sparingly, and use it in such a way if we're going to use it at all, that it illustrates the fact that people are set up differently, they are adapted differently. And on the positive side of that, you could maybe say that if nothing else, it encourages you to model things from somebody else's perspective, which is valuable in relationships.
It does have its value. It's when it's elaborated beyond where it should be used, and there's a number of ways that happens with typology that's relevant to the concepts of the or the constructs of the anima, animus, and the shadow. The most fundamental thing in any person is character. Character basically is your irreducible nature. Character is not the same thing as type. You could, for example, have, and I'm supposedly an INTP, for example. Don't always function as one, but but that's a matter sometimes of choice. If you could have an INTP who was a psychopath, and you could have an INTP who was a saint, they're both INTPs. What's the difference between them? Character. So type really is superficial, and it expresses character. In fact, it expresses pretty much everything that's active psychodynamically within a person. And some of the structures which are non-ego, but within the overall economy of a human system psychologically, will express themselves differently through type configuration, but that doesn't mean that they have that particular configuration intrinsically to themselves. As Pauline was saying before, that a so-called INTP will have a ESFJ, if we think in Myers-Briggs terms, anima. That you don't see that in real life. If you're not deliberately looking to find typology and collapse everything into that, that's not what you see. You see that it will emerge very often through the auxiliary function, for example, firstly, of that person's type, so-called reported type, and then other things move around as well. So do not reduce things to type. Character is the most important thing, and how that's expressed. And character will determine how the shadow works too, the so-called shadow, and the anima and the animus, both of them through relating.
Yeah, I actually think it's more helpful to think in terms of character and instinct. I think if you replace the idea of the shadow with instinct, you actually start to get somewhere, because if there is conflict in somebody's nature, then it's likely to be conflict between character and instinct. And some people have more of a problem with that than others, because of the fundamental way in which their character is set up. So some people are naturally more conflicted about expressing themselves instinctively than others. And, to a greater or lesser extent, how someone is configured too, of course, will be affected by their learning, their experience, the kind of sort of moral complex attitudes that come from or are created by their family or from the culture more largely. And I think that's a better way to try and get a handle on why people sometimes feel conflicted or feel divided within themselves about some of the choices that are asked of them. I think it's the collision between those two structures more than it is even between character and shadow.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, character and instinct then, if they're taken, in fact, we know this, we know that at the root of pretty much every neurosis, that's what you find. It's character versus instinct at that level. And you can see where that comes from with respect to Freud, for example, and his constructs of the id. In other words, how he collapsed his intuition and his experience into his model as that developed, just as Jung did. And for him, instinct was what he was seeing. He was seeing frustrated instinct in his patients. But because of the kind of people that he saw and the cultural period within which he lived, then those frustrated instincts took on a particular form. And for him, it was aggression and sexuality. So those two were the things that were causing a problem with respect to a person's character. And then you had the neurotic split. And then Freud, because of his past, just as with Jung with his, and the influences on his life, began to shape what he was seeing actively through projection rather than receiving the facts as they were from the other person. This pretty much happens with almost all psychological theories that they become closed systems. But when we moved, well, Pauline in particular, when she moved out of working in a psychiatric hospital, and I moved out of working mainly with cardiac patients, and we both went into primary healthcare, we were struck by the fact that pretty much everybody we saw had fundamentally Freudian issues to do with what used to be called hysteria, and it was then called a conversion reaction or a somatoform disorder. In other words, a biopsychosocial representation of the neurosis. But the thing that was manifest mostly in terms of their conscious understanding was the agitation and distress caused by the frustration of instinct when set against the conditioning that their character had received.
Yes.
And Freud was brilliant, and Joseph Breuer at understanding that, giving a baseline for understanding that. And where Jung really came in, was his development of Pierre Janet's understanding of what Jung called complexes. And putting those two views together meant that we could make pretty good predictions on how a person's case would go, and also to design the right kind of intervention to help them. Where if we'd have collapsed solely into Freud or solely into Jung, we couldn't have helped any of those people at all. These are real people, you know, not people who have lived a provisional life by simply accessing psychological theories and replacing a relationship to the real world with those as a fantasy. And that's a pretty prevalent thing at the moment amongst educated young people, particularly men, is that they're so divided from their instincts that they're moving towards a mythopoetic fantasy version of life, which is fed by the misunderstanding generally of a lot of Jungian ideas. So again, it's so important to understand what character is, what instinct is, and that the frustration of instinct, which is beneficial usually, it means you to be well adapted, then gets turned into something unpleasant to compensate for our maladaptations. And that then becomes secondarily repressed or dissociated. And then we get the typical neurosis as it emerges, which you experience or will experience if ever you work in primary healthcare in a high profile or a high turnover environment. There's so many people are coming through all the time, all sorts of disturbances. To go on about the anima and the shadow, or individuation even, to people like that will get absolutely nowhere. But if you want to turn Jung into a philosophy, which is bracket fantasy, closed bracket, and then have a schizoid withdrawal from engagement with life, well, that's fine. You do that. That's a fantasy. That's not related to the real world. But where people are really suffering, then we see what's actually going on inside a person's psyche and in their life. I'm glad that Pauline mentioned that, because that's so important, and it really brings about, for example, why did Jung create the notion of the shadow? I said before, because he was examining himself and he found his own issues as he went along, starting with his persona, then the idea of the shadow, and then the idea of the anima and so forth. But there is another fact. When he split with Freud, it was important for him not to emphasize instincts, right? Because that was too associated with Freud. Freud's understanding of instincts was very, very limited compared to today's, but it was sufficient for Jung to say, well, I can't completely ignore them, but I'll cover them up with something else, which is his construct of archetypes. The archetype being a whole situation is what we would call a meta instinct, which we can explain in another video, but that's supported by the findings of affective, that is emotional neuroscience, and by neuropsychoanalysis, which is the combination of affective neuroscience with psychoanalysis. The two relatively new but groundbreaking disciplines that are emerging into the field now, and that's modifying people's views and understanding what instinct is. So he couldn't identify the instinct. That means he had to replace the id with something. And the id was considered to be a repository of everything dark and repressed and unwanted. That immediately becomes Jung's shadow. So Jung dealt with instinct by saying it was shadow, and then by turning the positive side of it into his fantasy projection that he called archetypes. Unpleasant to hear, perhaps, but it's true. And it's the same with his concept of the anima. He met that because he was engaged with his own inner work when he was becoming so schizoid and so withdrawn from life. And notice I say schizoid and not schizophrenic. There is a huge difference. And that he had this, should we say, Freudian propensity to want to have affairs outside of his marriage, which needed satisfaction, should we say, with a number of women. Then the anima had to be created. And that, of course, was some kind of an archetype which gave an excuse, an alibi for his behavior, which also provided the same kind of thing with respect to his shadow too. So the shadow was less important because now he discovered the anima, and that justified it all. Where in reality, though he'd rejected Freud, he hadn't gone beyond him. He hadn't solved the Freudian side of his equation at all, any more than he had the Adlerian one to do with his will to power and control, which is attested throughout the whole of his life. But that's something you really should read some really good biographies on Jung to find out about. So there's all of that to consider. Do you want to enter into a state of schizoid withdrawal yourself from engaging with life, generating a fictional narrative about Jung as a justification for that? Are you interested in real people, real depth psychology, helping people overcome real things? And then at that point, you can go one way or the other when you encounter Jung, and well, best of luck to you, whichever path you take, because they're both difficult. But when it comes to the so-called anima and animus, and our experiences, that's far better described as simply being the instinct to relate. It's your relating function. And the shadow is just misfired instincts.
One thing he did say, Steve, that is, I think is absolutely true.
Oh, he said a lot of things true.
Yes, of course he did. But this specifically, because we're talking about the anima and the animus here, is that women don't understand women. And in his introduction to Esther Harding's book, The Way of All Women, he mentions it there, that when women write about women, they write on women's issues, they tend not to reach any kind of real conclusions about what it means for women to have feelings, to have feminine feelings, that there seems to be a difficulty for women. And so I think, to be fair to men, it has to be said, if women don't understand women, what chance do men have, really? And I think that was his point.
Well, obviously, I agree with you.
Yes. And so why don't women understand women? Because they don't understand the issue of the animus properly. And if they can't get to grips with it, how can men get to grips with the concept of the animus or the relating function, whatever you want to call it? It's going to be doubly difficult for them. But it is where we need to go. Women do need to sort this out for themselves, because that will assist men no end in understanding women, and that has to be better for relationships as a whole. Yeah.
Well, Esther, thank you. And that's all very, very, very important. And yes, I did miss that out. Esther Harding's book, by the way, is a foundational text for feminism.
It is.
And if you read that introduction, it's quite cruel.
Well, it's very hard hitting.
In the way that Jung often was in his relationships to women. And that was part of the power of the word that he had, that drew women to him. It was part of the trap. So he understood that, because that was the way that he lived his life. He was something of a wordsmith, and he played that game effectively to control people, particularly women. So,
but women played into it. They played their part, and it's what I said earlier about being drawn to someone who has what appears to be a giant intellect. That's extremely attractive to women. I would say it's more attractive than physical attractiveness, without a doubt. I'm not saying that doesn't play its part in relationships. It does. But intellectual capacity for women who have the potential to develop themselves will be enormously attractive. And the women, it's no secret, the women around Jung made all sorts of personal sacrifices to just be around him and to support him in his work. So, if that's not a demonstration, of how these things operate, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. In a kind of a non-Paleolithic environment, that kind of thing would rise to the top, because as societies become more complicated, then people who can think and generate novel ideas and solutions are the people more likely to move things along and obtain resources. But where that's not there and it's more paleolithic, then you're going to have the more usual baseline kind of attractions for both sides of the biological equation. But that is there.
I think in modern life, you tend to see it in women where they're actually very comfortable in a material sense. They have resources and can almost afford to be dissatisfied with what they have. And if they have the potential to develop themselves, it will almost inevitably be projected until they've actually dealt with it themselves on the inside. And obviously that's the, you know, that's the journey work of a lifetime for women as it is for men, to take that projection back and to work with it on the inside and to develop themselves, and to not ask that a man carry that for them. Because otherwise men are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't win. They literally can't do right for doing wrong sometimes.
Well,
and
that's interesting.
I think it needs addressing.
So with the woke woman then, so-called, there is no relating to external men. So what we could predict on the basis of that, even if this wasn't observable, and so it's not really a prediction, but you could have predicted that where that would happen, then you'd get an inflation of the one-sidedness that's caused by the lack of relating to men in women, and then you get an absurd caricature based on instincts which are misplaced and caffected all over the place and not really operating for them. And we really see that, don't we, in woke culture?
Oh, you do, very much so. And it's kind of reduced to superficialities, to things like who does the chores, you know, who does the washing up or the cleaning or whatever, or, you know, as feminists would talk about it, whether it's in the home or at work, the kind of the, you know, the gender gap when it comes to labor, and who does you know, the most of one thing as opposed to another. And it's the stuff of so much unhappiness in relationships. And I really do think a lot of that boils down to women not getting to grips with their own animus development, and then just lashing out and blaming men for not doing enough, for not noticing enough, for not working hard enough, for not providing enough, for not being engaged enough with the family, or whatever it happens to be. There are so many examples in which it plays out. And
wokeism's more aggressive even than that, though, isn't it? Because it's a neutering dynamic.
Well, it manipulates that dynamic for its own ends.
It does, it does. That's another story, of course, about how that's being regulated.
Of course,
which isn't just political, by the way. It's at another level altogether outside of politics.
Yes, it is.
But yeah, and of course, this is you're researching this for your book, aren't you?
Well,
sorry to leak that out.
No, that's okay. It's you have an expression, Steve, about eating a porcupine.
Oh yeah.
Well, once you start, you have to continue until you finish. Till you finish and you've eaten every quill, as painful as it might be. And I have to say, reading some of these feminist texts is pretty painful.
It's horrible.
But it has to be done, and hopefully the outcome will be something positive, and certainly working hard on that.
Yeah, well, it's great. I mean, the parts that I've seen are absolutely fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to reading them myself. And I can be schooled again, just like I have this afternoon by my lady wife here. Schooled me in what I've been missing, which is always good, to learn as much as you can.
Well, we learn from one another.
We do.
We do. The thing. Yeah.
We do indeed. So the shadow then is an artificial construct. We shouldn't address the shadow so-called first. You go to relating first. If you solve relating, almost everything to do with the shadow is automatically solved. If you relate properly, you live properly. You're in harmony with your instincts and with your environment. If, however, you don't, you then generate a compensation from your instincts, which will surface psychologically as the impression of everything that you are doing wrong. And that will then feel as if it's something like the shadow, which is really unpleasant, and we repress it and then we project it. But as soon as we're in harmony with the homeostasis, the balance of our anticipated lifespan development, then the shadow as such begins to shrink dramatically. It makes no biological sense to have an organism divided against itself and constantly at war. because that species could not adapt. It would be too busy fighting itself and destroying itself. And clearly that's not been the case with humans. As dangerous as human nature can be and as destructive as it can be, we've nevertheless managed to survive, which shows that we're pretty much doing something right by nature. Now, there are arguments, of course, that the population's too big and that kind of thing, and that we're damaging the environment. All sorts of arguments about that can be made, but fundamentally, the adaptation of the human species, when it's homeostatic, is just right. And if we internalize the notion that men are 99% female and women are 99% men, and that we have this inner twin that is at least equal and opposite and perhaps overpoweringly more dangerous and powerful than we are, that is a mental illness. The ideas themselves are mentally ill. Yeah. And they cause untold harm and damage. And if you approach someone who hasn't gotten used to being exposed to those ideas, just an ordinary person in a doctor's clinic, and give them those suggestions, and they are already suffering, you know, you're going to push them into a psychiatric unit. It's a dangerous thing, and you need to think about that we're meant to be normally and optimally, if possible, adapted to the genomic anticipation for our potential and for our life. And if we do that, we're going to be generally happy.